This is a conversation with the writer Daniel Pinchbeck. I first found Daniel's work with his book Breaking Open the Head, which is all about his journey with psychedelics. He's then moved on to cover everything from social change, existential risk, the occult, and much more. This conversation covers many different topics, including our different attitudes to the subject of conspiracy theories, a long conversation about the situation with Ukraine and Russia. We also addressed his high-profile sex scandal and cancellation from a few years ago. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Daniel, and I hope you do too. Daniel, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this feels like a conversation that's a little bit overdue, Daniel. We've been in touch kind of informally. We've been at some of the same events in the past. My friend Ronan, I think you came to Alter Ego, that my friend Ronan ran a couple of years ago now, maybe a little bit more, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So we've been, and I've been a big fan of your work, especially your book, Breaking Open the Head, which I think came out now in 2002, all about your exploration with psychedelics. And I think I read that twice. So yeah, I've been aware of your work, and we've been in very similar circles, similar kind of backgrounds. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Maybe before I kind of summarize what this conversation might be about, if you could just do a sort of introduction, potted history of your background and where you've ended up now.
Wow. Okay. Let me think about that. So yeah, I mean,
the elevator pitch, Daniel. I know there's a lot to get through.
I mean, I'm from New York City. My parents were artists. My mother's a writer. I was working in journalism, in magazines in my 20s, also, writing poetry and fiction. I edited a literary magazine. I had a kind of spiritual emergency, existential crisis in my late 20s that led me back to psychedelics, which I'd explored in college. That led me to write this first book, Breaking Open the Head, on psychedelic shamanism. That was like before the new psychedelic renaissance. So it felt very fresh and kind of dangerous terrain. When the book came out, I was even afraid I would get stopped in airports. You really were not allowed to talk about psychedelics publicly in the mainstream. So it was kind of breaking new territory, and I think helps maybe shift the cultural discourse. Actually, the book was fairly well received, with decent seller, and was reviewed nicely in the New York Times and so on. With that book, I went to Africa. I went through the Iboga initiation in Gabon. I visited an indigenous community in the Ecuador and the Amazon to work with ayahuasca, visited another indigenous group in Mexico to work with psilocybin, also wrote about Burning Man and kind of psychedelic chemistry and shosholgan and so on. And I had a number of experiences that were kind of transpersonal, mystical, occult, kind of psychic, paranormal. And this was not something that I had, believed in before writing the book. I came from a more skeptic, materialist background. So it ended up engendering a very deep transformation of worldview and paradigm. And it also led me to another book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, which was basically some of the main people that I've looked at for the first book, including Terence McKenna and also this Jose Arguelles. And they were very focused on kind of these Mesoamerican prophecies, this idea that there was some inevitable transformation of consciousness that was occurring. So yeah, so that led me to write the 2012 book, where I worked with the Santo Daime in Brazil and explored crop circles in England and looked at a lot of esoteric phenomena, psi phenomena, monistic idealism as a kind of philosophy. And people like Jean Gebser and Carl Jung and Rudolf Steiner and so on. And so that book came out. Then I started a magazine, Reality Sandwich. I had a company called Evolver. I was trying to put ideas into practice because I was very concerned that we only had a relatively short period of time to deal with the ecological catastrophe and also kind of political economic crises and so on. So I started a movement. We had many local groups that sort of fell apart ultimately for various reasons. And then I wrote a third book, How Soon Is Now, which was an effort to kind of apply the sort of worldview that I just developed around psychedelic phenomenology and so on, but try to sort of map out kind of a systems design model using people ranging from Buckminster Fuller to Hannah Arendt. What would be the pathway to avert system crash and all that kind of stuff. So recently, I've been writing some smaller books. Well, I wrote a book called When Plants Dream with a young woman anthropologist, Sophia Rocklin, which was like it's like a whole history of ayahuasca, almost like a biography of ayahuasca, looking at many different aspects. And I've been writing some shorter books, self-publishing. I wrote a book on the afterlife, looking at a range of different perspectives on whether there's any possible existence, like spirit or soul after death, what we can learn from all the studies of near-death experience, mediumship, yada yada. Yeah, so here I am.
So yeah, lots of kind of jumping off points and overlaps with a lot of the conversations we've been hosting on Rebel Wisdom around sort of Game B as a kind of placeholder for an alternative system. So yeah, there's a huge amount of kind of jumping off points. To kind of keep this conversation as narrow as we can for the next hour or so, I'd love to talk a little bit broadly about conspiracy, because this is a topic that I'm actually publishing a piece at the same time as this about that you've already read about Majid Nawaz's appearance on Joe Rogan. And the topic of conspiracy is one that I feel very, wary about talking about too much on the channel for various reasons that I'll explain and we can kind of go into. But you're someone who's looked at it, and I think you're the right person to explore this topic with, because you've looked at it to quite a deep level. Why I'm hesitant is because firstly, it's an overloaded term, that there is sort of, it's a way of dismissing people, and when you talk about it, a lot of people bring that up, that it's an overloaded term. You're talking about kind of something that is, by definition, any sort of secret collaboration between people could come under that term, but also there are kind of all-encompassing conspiracy theories like QAnon that, for me, kind of completely fall apart when you start looking at them. Also, we've got the kind of Illuminati light iconography here, so we're kind of attract. And I find the reason I was wary about putting out that piece about Majid Nawaz was, do I really want the heat? Do I really want to kind of go into, you get a lot of people with a lot of passion, you get a lot of people with kind of very esoteric perspectives, and a lot of kind of there's a lot of people there who are very, like, friends of mine in journalism have decided that it's a topic that's just not worth going into. Friends of mine, Carl Miller and Jamie Bartlett, found that they had a lot of very impassioned people who actually came around to their workplace, researched on them, kind of decided that they were definitely being paid by the government, or that kind of like deep conspiracy mindedness, that at some point I'm just like, do I really want to go into this topic? So yeah, I've thrown a lot at you there. What's your kind of attitude to the general topic of conspiracy stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, a strange attractor, for a certain type of, personality, psychology, schizotypal, I guess is one phrase to describe it. I come at this from a, kind of different angle, I guess, because I had all these shamanic, psychic, paranormal experiences. And then I got very interested in thinkers like, ranging from Rudolf Steiner to Castaneda to Gurdjieff, who, kind of offer a whole different lens or perspective that, that's, there's kind of the visible world and the motivations of humans, all that stuff that's very obvious or, whatever to us. But, maybe there are also these other more invisible kind of occult energies sort of functioning underneath, and, that are, we don't even really have very good ways to speak about them. I mean, Steiner talked about, he was an esoteric Christian, and he talked about kind of spiritual forces that work on the human being all of the time, that pull us into these different directions. So he took the devil from Christianity and he separated out into these different forces that he described as, this is just mapping. It's not like a total, this is not like an absolute thing, but Ahrimanic and Luciferic forces, like Lucifer being light bringers, these forces that are kind of bringing us up through like imagination, genius, inspiration, poetry, but also kind of destabilize us and pull us like away from the earth. I mean, psychedelics are very Luciferic. Burning Man is very Luciferic in a way. And then another, the Ahrimanic, which is related to the sort of evil earth spirit of Zoroastrianism, kind of pulling us down towards minerality, material technologies, like away from any kind of transcendence or spirituality. And Steiner really felt that, in our time, the Ahrimanic qualities were becoming more, powerful. And this was like the triumph of, reductive materialism and the scientific method, and that this would ultimately lead to an event in the 21st century, which he talked about as the incarnation of Ahriman, which I tend to think might have something to do with, AI, generalized artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, the convergence of all these different fields of inquiry. And yeah, I kind of take his ideas quite seriously because, through my own shamanic explorations and experience with ayahuasca, they seem to map the best. Are we being driven forward? I mean, I know you talked about another friend who used the term of an egregore, which is like a sort of collective thought form, or Jung talked about archetypes, but Jung also admitted ultimately late in life, those archetypes were very similar to what, shamanic and esoteric cultures talk about as spirits, So are there sort of underlying archetypal forces that seem to be rushing humanity in different directions? I mean, even the idea of the, apocalypse, which I wrote a lot in the 2012 book as a sort of archetype, for Jung, it was ultimately a psychological archetype. It represents the coming of the self into conscious realization, as the student editor talked about. But it also means, the unveiling or the revealing of the hidden thing. So are we somehow in sort of this apocalyptic time? So when I think about, these conspiracies, I think a lot of them, like, we're never going to be able to figure out who was 9/11 orchestrated. I mean, there's so many weird qualities to it. Were there aspects of the coronavirus that were orchestrated? Was there a, weaponized virus? Were there corporate, pharmaceutical interests who, wanted to, turn the world into a sort of weird paranoid prison camp of, and then vaccinate everybody? It feels to me that those, when you get into human motivations, it's like too murky. But if we think that maybe there's, these Ahrimanic energies or egregores that are pushing humanity in certain directions, it gives us a different kind of vector, maybe for thinking about these things. It opens up spaces for us to look at the irrational in a more rational way.
Yeah, and I don't want to get sort of distracted into the detail, because I think that's one of the problems when we talk about these alternative narratives or conspiracy narratives, is that you get just lost in the weeds very, very quickly and then stuck on kind of different pieces of data or information. Although I have looked into, like, most of the conspiracy narratives I have looked into to some degree, like 9/11. I've spent a lot of time arguing with 9/11 conspiracy theorists. I've got quite a few thoughts on that topic, maybe to be explored in a future conversation. But you mentioned the word egregore, and this is one of the other reasons that I felt it was the right time to have this conversation, is that if there's a sort of directionality to where the conversation that I'm tracking is leading, it's in that direction. We had the idea of the egregore as some kind of group mind process that came up recently through BJ Campbell, and I interviewed him on Rebel Wisdom. That concept seemed to get a lot of traction on Twitter and elsewhere. And there's also quite a few other people homing in on similar ideas. And recently, I know you've seen the conversation that I hosted with Paul Kingsnorth and Mary Harrington, which also seemed to be kind of drifting in that same sort of direction, that was looking at a lot of the cultural situation, but bringing in a kind of a deeper lens that felt like it was drawing towards the metaphysical. It was drawing towards a sort of a sense of deeper patterns playing out that I think you're alluding to as well, that I think whether or not these are analogies or whether or not these are metaphors that are from people like Steiner or some of these kind of deeper thinkers of the past, whether or not, but they seem to be pointing to an underlying reality, whether they're actually, that there is a kind of usefulness to a lot of their models that is becoming more useful, because I think we are in those times where we are in the times of the breakdown of the current system. It's a kind of paradigm shift. I think is happening as we all sort of see the systems breaking down around us. And I think the one that's coming through is, we've talked a lot on Rebel Wisdom about the kind of return of the irrational, or the return of the religious, that we're going back into, we're in post-secular times. The sort of secular worldview is breaking down, and we're now re-entering the times of kind of religion that we never actually left, because the technocratic worldview was actually religion pretending not to be a religion, which I know you've kind of written about in the past as well.
You mean like the singularity kind of being like a version of Christian kind of salvationism in a way?
Yes, and it being, and all of that being rested on a kind of faith in human progress, a faith in technological progress, a belief in that in some ways was a religious manifestation. But yeah, that kind of became turbocharged through sort of techno-utopianism, Silicon Valley kind of religious futurism.
Yeah, which works wonderfully for globalizing corporations. That became the sort of ethos, because then, even though life may be crap, in the immediate now, it's like, oh, look how great it's all going to be, in 30 years. I mean, that's how like, all this wealth in Silicon Valley, yet like unbelievably horrific homeless population in like Oakland and San Francisco, like, Zuckerberg, take like, a few of those hundreds of millions, build some place for these people to sleep, for God's sake. But no, because even though now sucks, there's going to be this like future perfection up ahead where the nano machines clean everything up. And so we don't really have to care about the now, that's, yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of my work has been, particularly in the 2012 book, to kind of look at these kind of parallel philosophical viewpoints, whether it's like Jean Gebser and Steiner, and the Mesoamerican cosmologies, and see that in ways they're saying the same things. And we get our problem is that we're very our language is very limited in a way, and we get locked in. Our language locks us very quickly into a certain paradigm or a certain structure, and then we lose our maneuverability, our flexibility to sort of move between these different articulations. So it's like, so for me, Steiner is like, it's not like you want to completely adapt his model of reality, but it's one map, and we need a number of different maps. Then we need to be able to like shift between the maps and not forget when we're in one map and its relationship to another map and so on. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, and what's your, I mean, you watched the conversation between Mary and Paul. What was your sense of the kind of direction of travel of that dialogue?
Yeah, I didn't absolutely finish it, but I watched a lot of it. Yeah, I think that their idea that this technological direction is kind of robbing us of a lot of our humanity, and the life world is being kind of desiccated for this kind of like fanaticism around some kind of machine future. I resonate with a lot of that. And when Kingsnorth talks about the sort of the machine, to me that's similar to the Ahrimanic idea. Or another thinker who ended up with a very similar set of ideas was John Lilly, who talked about sort of like a synthetic or like silicon-based sentience that was sort of using humans as a vehicle to kind of like take over this in the material world in a way.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, some of the, I mean, Mary was talking about sort of reactionary feminism. Was that her term?
Yes.
So then I was looking to some of that. I was looking to some of the women that she talked about, and then people that they cited, and it's going to be too much to get into in this conversation. But I mean, as we know, I went through a whole like cancellation. I admitted to public mistakes around sexuality, and I did do things that I completely think were wrong, and made all sorts of mistakes. But there was kind of a principle behind it, and that I sort of, coming from the sort of 60s, like Allen Ginsberg tradition, he was like a friend in my childhood, and, my mother was good friends with. I sort of believed principally in this idea of like a, sexual liberation and emancipation of Eros. I was a huge fan of like Herbert Marcuse, like Eros and Civilization and so on. And I feel that now that whole line of kind of inquiry has been very shut down, by the sort of new kind of like neo-Victorianism, and I don't know. I mean, we're at a very strange place in terms of all of that. I'm not probably the best person to go into all of that, but I mean, I'm really fascinated. Like Matt Taibbi has been covering it. He just did a really great interview with this woman, Laura Kipnis, who's kind of a contrarian, kind of like sex positive feminist, who's arguing. She wrote a book talking about how sort of these Title IX kind of things in academic, universities in the U.S. where if a professor does anything that's incorrect, they're then cast out of the university and have to sort of recant. That it's very similar to kind of the McCarthyism. Like there's a lot of hysteria around sexuality now. And I don't know how we bring that down, but it feels like it's part of this. It's a puzzle in the larger puzzle piece that even leads all the way back to the victory of the right wing in the U.S. and Putinism and the mania that seems to be happening, authoritarianism. I don't know. All these things are all, in my mind, kind of linked together as these different strands, and to go down one, you ultimately have to connect all of them.
Yeah, and you mentioned use the word cancellation, and I was going to come to that a little bit later, but maybe now's a good time to talk about it, because I did ask you before this interview if you'd be happy to talk about this, because you did have a pretty high profile, you called it a cancellation, where you I think you've said that you misbehaved and were kind of called out publicly for it, and I also thought it was a real opportunity for us to kind of discuss why, because I felt a journalistic obligation to ask about this. Because, and I think it's interesting for us to pull apart, and you also recognize that there was a journalistic obligation to ask about this. And I think it's worth maybe pulling that apart, because I think we've lost a lot of those. I think a lot of these journalistic techniques became sort of weirdly weaponized in the legacy media, but I think we lost them completely in the alternative media. And I think there is something important here in terms of, like, I feel like there's an obligation of me bringing this up to make the viewer aware of this background, and them to be able to make up their minds about whether you're genuinely repentant or whether you are or not. Like, I don't think it would be fair to do this interview without bringing it up, without mentioning it. And I'd like first to kind of ask you a little bit about that event and what happened and what you realized through it, or whether you recognize that you had misbehaved, and how you reflect on it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely feel that I made all sorts of mistakes, I don't really want to go in. I mean, I did an interview with Shakruna with a number of like women anthropologists. I kind of went through it in depth. I don't necessarily want to like go back over all that ground, but yeah, I mean, people are not perfect and they make mistakes, and that's part of life, and we've sort of lost. I mean, I went to people that I had wronged or felt that I had wronged, and asked for their forgiveness, and actually received their forgiveness, at least at that point. I mean, I don't really know what else one could do. And I thought about going through more of like a restorative justice process, but then I spoke to some men who'd gone through that type of process, and it really didn't even feel like it helped or made a difference in a way. I mean, also there was like, we don't even know what constitutes like community at this point. Like, is there a psychedelic community? Who's running that community? Like, what's the rules, regulations of the community? I mean, all this stuff is very nebulous. So I felt like I did the best that I could do, and took a career hit and have accepted that, and have tried to change my behavior and be a better person, and learn from what I did wrong. And I'm still an imperfect person,
And what you did wrong was, would it be fair to summarize as kind of abusing your power and influence for sexual gratification?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really, the thing is that I honestly didn't really see it at that time in that way. I mean, once again, there were a couple of very specific times when I, did things that I really regret, involving like drugs and alcohol, which I talked about in that piece. you know, for me mainly, I really felt that these sort of restrictions around eroticism and sexuality were you know, socially prescribed. But yeah, so sometimes I would have relationships with, you know, younger women or women who were associated with the, you know, the project that I'd been building, Evolver, you know, I mean, but I was really coming from the sort of Allen Ginsberg perspective, where it's like older and younger relationships are like okay, like teachers and students can have relationships. I mean, he was coming from a gay context, which we you know, homosexual, which we tend to think is very different. For me, it was just like kind of normal, but it was also, you know, I think that when I was younger, I felt like deprived of certain possibilities, and then suddenly I did become more celebrated, and I was part of this community that was very explorational. And you know, I didn't necessarily know what the limits or boundaries were, and they weren't even a set back then. And I'd also grown up, you know, in the New York context, in the media and the literary world in my 20s, where, you know, alcohol and other drugs fueled a lot of social interactions. So, you know, it was kind of like a different context in a way, you know.
Yeah, and I also thought it was worth sort of reflecting on what the journalistic kind of obligation of that is from my perspective. Like I know you, we've hung out a few times. I believe that you have genuinely reflected on your behavior. Otherwise, I don't think I would have hosted you here. I think I'd have been more reluctant to do so. But I think the reason for bringing this up, I think, is for me, it's a kind of, there is a kind of journalism by numbers thing, which I think maybe some of us have internalized, of like, oh, well, you have, if you speak to this person, you have to ask them about this. And I think a lot of people get pissed off about that, because it's like, every time I'm interviewed, you bring up this thing that I did and I feel like I've dealt with it, and that's not okay. And I understand that perspective as well. But I think there is a kind of obligation that I feel as someone with a platform of a certain size. It's not massive. It's not kind of anything compared to a lot of legacy media, but it has a certain size, and hosting you is me saying this person should be listened to. This person's got some good ideas. So I do feel that sense of obligation to also balance that with, and there are things that Daniel has done in the past that he's reflected on, and others were very unhappy about, and he's also reflected on. And I think that's part of that for me is part of the kind of responsibility that I feel that I have, and I think hopefully people who have some kind of platform also feel to some degree. And I think it's worth, yeah, how do you reflect on that kind of dynamic? Because you're also from a journalistic background. And
yeah, no,
like
I think you're right to ask me. And, you know, I mean, and, you know, it's such a hot button area right now that it, you know, it's not something that I, you know, like, I mean, you know, I was sort of in an interestingly kind of, I was the one who kind of like spoke out on Facebook and sort of brought it up. You know, maybe I didn't have to do that, but, you know, very few men have, you know, publicly stepped forward and confessed they did this and that wrong. I mean, Morgan Spurlock is one of the only other men who I know who kind of did that, kind of, and that also, like, and he had like a production company which he then lost, and all these projects that got crashed. So it's like, you know, it's, I think, I mean, I think that it's a very dicey situation, you know, partially because, you know, men have not really been able to tell the more complete and complex part of their own story, because there's so much anger and hatred directed. You know, I tried to do it in the Shakruna piece. I mean, I feel that, you know, men like Warren Farrell, I think you maybe have interviewed, who wrote The Myth of Male Power. I mean, that's a very important kind of corrective, you know, perspective that, you know, we're all flawed. You know, there's patriarchy. I mean, he says, you know, it's the best. You know, it's just men and women have been trying to do their best under situations that have developed over centuries of, you know, oppression and miscommunication and so on. You know, so yeah, and you know, sometimes, you only grow by making mistakes, and, you know, sometimes those mistakes hurt other people too, and that's just also part of life, you know.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things here. One is the idea that we're in a kind of pseudo-religious panic around lots of different topics but there is no possibility of redemption. Like there doesn't seem to be any kind of redemption available for people who've been cancelled or who've been attacked. And the other, interestingly, so Warren actually feels, so Warren wrote The Myth of Male Power. Fascinating guy. If people aren't familiar with him, he was quite influential within the women's movement. He was working for the National Organization for Women in the 70s, and then also started hosting men's groups in the same way as the kind of women's consciousness raising groups were happening. And he felt like, oh, there are stories here that haven't been heard, because women have never had their voices heard in the same way until the 1960s and came into society in a different way. But he said, well, men have never had that. There's never been a space for a men's emotional reality. And this is something that I hear a lot from the guys who come to our men's retreats, that they're given these weird conflicting messages, which is on one hand to be more emotionally vulnerable, to be more emotionally open, and also to stop taking up so much space. And there's this kind of like paradox in the culture at the moment that I think degenerates into kind of oppositional dynamics between men and women, but hopefully doesn't have to. And I feel like maybe we're potentially reaching a place now where we can have a healthier conversation. And interestingly, the other thing I was going to say is that Warren regrets the title, The Myth of Male Power, and now he's republishing it as The Paradox of Male Power, which I think is a slightly less kind of challenging.
That's a better title.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then also, I mean, this sort of, it's like this is an area where I'm scared to say things that I actually think, because it's just so dangerous, in a way. But I mean, I'm watching some of the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, and what seems to be coming out is that she was the abusive one. Primarily, and he was a drunk and a drug addict and chaotic and, maybe not very emotionally expressive or whatever, but that's also kind of like, we haven't reached a cultural space where we can begin to acknowledge kind of female shadow dynamics, which I also, experienced, like, people saying untrue things that I had done, or, making up, and while admitting that I did things that were wrong, so there's a huge cultural work, societal work that needs to be done here. And it's like, it's the problem is that we just it feels like we have this ever-growing pile, like, okay, we haven't dealt, we barely dealt with COVID, we can't deal with the environment, and now we have, this, World War III. I mean, it's kind of like, plus we haven't dealt with corporate power, plus we have like wealth, inequality, plus we have technocratic surveillance society. I mean, it's like how, it does begin to feel that it's just too top heavy, that the whole thing is going to just, break apart, and then we'll have to like pick up the fragments again, wherever's left.
Yeah, I'll just close off the gender conversation to get back to some of those other topics by saying, like, in a way, the whole gender conversation was really integral to Rebel Wisdom. We started leading men's retreats and did quite a lot of pieces at the beginning with people like Warren Farrell about men and women after Me Too. What does a healthy relationship look like? And I think part of it is this sense that we have to get to a point of recognizing that women are people too. There's kind of men often, the conversation around toxic masculinity, men will often act out in more violent ways. Women will often act out in more emotionally violent ways. And I think because we're not able to have a sensible conversation about that in the legacy media, in the mainstream, that conversation goes underground and becomes much more toxic. So instead of a conversation, like, especially in like the manosphere, instead of a conversation about, women can act like this, the conversation turns into women will always act like this, women will always look for someone better than you, hypergamy, all of this kind of idea, which is obviously a part of the truth particularly for I would say women and men who have not really evolved internally and are not looking for kind of a partnership with someone they consider an equal. Often they're looking for someone they can dominate, and that happens on both sides of the spectrum. Like, because that conversation is not had in a healthy way, I think it often has gone underground and been had in a very unhealthy way. But my sense is, as someone who's kind of dialed into the media landscape, I think we're reaching a point where we're able to have that conversation in a more like it feels like we're ready for that now. It feels like the conversation is, and I've had really interesting conversations with particularly a BBC producer recently, where she brought up out of nowhere the idea of toxic femininity, and that the conversation felt completely unbalanced, and that would never have happened 3 years ago. So I'm kind of hopeful that we might be able to move that conversation on in a meaningful way. Did you want to say anything, or should we go back to conspiracy and Ukraine, Russia?
Whatever you want to talk about, I'm at your service.
Yeah, let's maybe talk about Ukraine, Russia, because that's one of the other reasons that we're having this conversation now. Is I've seen your, like, because of your kind of interest in conspiracies, and you're in an environment that leans very anti-mainstream, very kind of contrarian, and I've seen that space in particular get very like pro-Russian propaganda seems to do very well. Like once people start disbelieving the mainstream narrative, often they'll end up in positions that for me are kind of indistinguishable from like Putin propaganda. And I've seen you take a very morally clear and very ethical line in a way that I think I've seen so many people get captured by their audience over the period of COVID in particular, and just give their audience what they want and get dragged further and further into a kind of reactive, contrarian position. And what I've seen is that you've actually said many things on this topic where you've challenged your own audience. You've called out people who are friends, like Russell Brand, for some of the stuff that they've been putting out. And that's kind of shown me that, I've been impressed with that kind of moral clarity of, just because you realize that the West has lots of problems, it doesn't mean that you're going to overlook the fact that Putin is Putin's Russia is a kind of old imperialist power, and doing things that no Western country would be able to get away with nowadays without kind of mass public uproar and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, what's your take on broader take on kind of Russia and Putin at the moment?
Well, I mean, I think there's no doubt that it's an extremely dangerous situation, for the world. But I also, don't think. I mean, I think that the West is doing the right thing by kind of rallying and supporting them, with weaponry. I mean, there's so many different takes to be had. Maybe you can focus me on which part of the take. I mean,
why do you think many are failing to sort of see the wood for the trees when it comes to?
Well, a lot of American or European American leftists have extreme animosity towards kind of the U.S. and its allies over the last decades for tons of atrocious activities. The Gulf War, the Iraq War, overturning democratically elected governments in South America. Supporting Saudi Arabia, which is another, miserable dictatorship, obviously for, energy interests and so on. So, the sense is that the West has completely, the US in particular, completely forfeited any kind of claim to moral authority or even legitimacy, and therefore has no right to, stand up in this situation. And that's a tough argument. I mean, what are you going to say, really? I mean, the Iraq War, like maybe 1 million Iraq citizens died, was trumped up evidence on weapons of mass destruction. It seems kind of clear that, on the one hand, you had like the Project for a New American Century with like Cheney and so on, and they, wanted a provocation to go into the Middle East and talked about how they needed like a Pearl Harbor level inciting incident to be able to access the strategic oil reserves of the Middle East. And then the whole thing was handled so incredibly badly. We had such hubris and arrogance, and probably maybe a little bit like Putin over the last couple of years. We built up this huge military arsenal, and like they were, the military brass were like, we want to use our toys and test out what we can do, and how good are we at our with our new destructive mechanisms and so on. So that was an atrocity. But what are we going to do? I mean, I think that Putin has made very clear, if you read a lot of his speeches, that he doesn't really, intend to stop at Ukraine, and he doesn't even really necessarily see this as a war with Ukraine. He sees it as a war with the U.S. and with NATO. And so either he is kind of ground to a halt and kind of some type of like line of resistance is actually established, or it's very likely that he just continues, and also, I mean, this poor, country of Ukraine, which to be honest, I didn't know too much about before. I mean, I hadn't been like studying Ukraine or whatever. I mean, now it's like, it's all lurking in the background. Like if we go back to like 2016 election and Hunter Biden in Ukraine and Trump and Russia and Ukraine, it's like, this really seems like it was simmering in the background of everything that happened in the US. But, it does seem that this is a country that had a lot of, problems and, different factions, and has been trying to modernize and kind of identify a president that they rallied behind and believed in as like a step towards like Europeanization and modernization. And what, sane group of people, would given the opportunity want to choose Putinism? Who would want to be under the military dictator, who creates a kleptocratic oligarchy and robs everybody blind to feed his own narcissistic power? So, what are we going to do? We're sort of trapped now, then the arguments are that it was actually the US's fault. Like Mearsheimer is one of the academics who's saying, okay, like, we made a line in the sand. We promised, Russia that, Ukraine would never become part of NATO. But yeah, I don't think that that argument works very well. I had different reasons. Hold on, it'll come back to me for a second. What do you think about that? Actually, turn over to you.
The Mearsheimer argument.
Yeah, I mean, that's another one of the leftists have the European American leftists have grabbed onto the sense that actually it's the US's fault, as almost everything in the world is, because we knew that if we flirted with NATO membership for Ukraine, it was going to lead to this,
Yeah, I think he makes the best version of that argument for sure. And it's fascinating that the left this is sort of the horseshoe theory that's interesting to watch, because Mearsheimer is a kind of probably best described as a paleoconservative, like definitely a kind of foreign policy realist. He's certainly not on the left, but he's being embraced by a lot of what is now the kind of anti-war, anti-imperialist left. And he makes a good argument. I think you can definitely say that the 2008 promising of NATO membership to Ukraine was a complete error that was made in at a time when the West sort of saw Russia as being kind of very
weak.
Very weak. And also it's fascinating to think about like what it must be like for someone like Putin, who grew up in a formative year when Russia was an equal partner, or seen as an equal partner with the US as a genuine superpower. And that sense of humiliation, that sense of thwarted ambition that really drives him and drives a lot of the Russian psyche. I think it's an incredibly narrow and pretty solipsistic perspective to say that the US is primarily responsible, and that the US has missteps around Russia. But you're taking out the fact, like, it's a pretty harsh perspective to say the US should not, or NATO should not have promised membership to the Baltic states, for example, because they were desperate to have that protection, because they were terrified about Russia. They saw what Russia was up to in its borders. It saw what it did in the Caucasus. It saw what it did in Georgia, and they desperately wanted protection. So it's a pretty, like, I think Mearsheimer is articulating a very hardcore realist perspective of Russia is an angry wolf or an angry bear and will act out in these ways. So we have to accommodate Russia's desire for control of its environment. It's like, well, okay, that's a consistent perspective, but you're consigning an awful lot of Ukrainians, you're consigning an awful lot of Latvians, Estonians, and Polish, almost certainly, to domination by an empire they don't want to be ruled by. And if I've got a bit more connection to Ukraine. There was an event that we went to in Kiev in 2019, I think, and met quite a few of the people there who were sort of fighting for democracy, who were looking towards the West. And I couldn't really look them in the eyes and say, no, actually, this isn't for you. Like, it's not up. And so I think what we're doing at the moment is the right, like, Ukraine is taking the main, they're lifting their own weight. Like, some of my friends there say that this is their blood sacrifice for creating themselves as a nation. Like, this is the environment where Ukraine, like, what they're going through now could sustain them for hundreds of years as a kind of national mythology. and that's extraordinary to see in real time, something like Zelensky, or who's somehow stepped up into this role that you would never have imagined someone with his background having stepped up into. And they're the ones who are obviously lifting the biggest weight, but we're supporting as much as we can get away with without provoking Russia into sort of provoking nuclear war, or provoking like a conflict that might spiral out of control. And so far, I think we're doing that pretty well. So that would be my kind of summary as someone, like I'm a former foreign producer, so I kind of follow a lot of these things to a fairly keen degree. That would be my biggest take, is I think we're doing the right thing. I think we could potentially even step it up with more weaponry. And obviously there's a geopolitical aim as well, that we're wanting to weaken Russia. But to be honest, they've weakened themselves. The ludicrous nature of how detached from reality Putin had become, and how weak the Russian army had become, and how, like, in a way, that's really reassuring. It's like it's reassuring to realize that those levers of power that Putin feels that are at his disposal, and all of those kind of army units on the map maybe don't really exist in any meaningful way. It feels a little bit like kind of Hitler in the bunker, where at the end of the Downfall movie, where the kind of the Sixth Army that he's moving around, it's like that doesn't exist anymore. So there's a sense that
do you think if Hitler was in the bunker and had 6,000 nuclear weapons and knew he was about to go down, he would have hit the button?
That's the terrifying thing, is whether there is enough. Yeah, if you start thinking about Putin's psychology and you recognize like what kind of man he is, like what kind of man he was in Dresden before, like he's been steeped in murder and chaos since he was in his 20s.
Yeah. Like I read the Fiona Hill book, The Operative in the Kremlin. I mean, I in no way consider myself in like an expert, on this.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been catching up and reading, stuff from different perspectives. But yeah, I mean, I hope that it wasn't, this idea of like totally isolating Russia. I mean, I know they're kind of doing it to themselves, but I mean, if you watch like the state TV, broadcasts from Russia, I mean, they're literally terrifying. I mean, they're really like, almost like wanting to push it to thermonuclear confrontation in a way that I've never even seen. Or it's, it does also bring up, some of these prophetic ideas around, I was talking to friends last night, who were saying that, sort of reminded me that 2024 is like apparently a big, number in the Kali Yuga kind of ideas for some esoterics. I mean, is this just like a, inevitable, removing some kind of inevitable threshold of, catastrophe, and massive heat waves in like Africa and India, like, at a certain point, human beings kind of goes up to like 100, I don't know, it is 120 degrees, and humans can only survive for a few hours. And then, I mean, one of the horrible things that's so annoying is like, Russia will be the great beneficiary of climate change. Like, they're turning out to be this most regressive force on the planet, but they're also going to be the beneficiaries. If everything else heats up and Africa and India become totally unlivable and everything descends into chaos, in the Siberia, they'll be like, growing, daffodils, it's
yeah. You mentioned one other thing that comes up as well is the idea of the nuclear taboo, which you're kind of alluding to there. I think for us kind of rational people, we kind of assume that everyone else is rational. I don't think you can, I don't think the nuclear taboo necessarily holds with Putin. Like, I can definitely see him using a tactical nuke in Ukraine just to demonstrate his power. The fact that he's prepared to do things. Absolutely. He's prepared to do things that the West is not prepared to do or would not. So I think we have to be very careful not to let that escalate. But I can see that as being a kind of end game of the war, of him like demonstrating, I'm prepared to do things that you wouldn't, I'm crazy, and I'll take things to a limit that you will not take things to before he pulls back from Ukraine. That seems very, very plausible.
We don't know if he's using the Richard Nixon madman approach where, Vietnam, we might just come and nuke you, or if he's actually gone kind of over the border,
Yeah.
But the only thing that would prevent him, because clearly he doesn't care about human life and he doesn't care about destroying cities or populations or absolutely barbaric, activity, would be this idea that using those nukes would end his alliance with like China and it's it is this realization that all these countries around the world are not even sanctioning Putin, whether it's like Mexico or Brazil, so the sort of like it does feel that we have on the one hand our kind of flawed, somewhat in distress democracies that have like just holding on by their fingernails, and now this sort of growing autocratic totalitarian states. And that unfortunately a lot of the technology that we thought was going to be a tool for liberalization, liberation, is actually turning out to be even more effective for autocracies like China, with the social credit system. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have to hope for another set of technological breakthroughs, whether it's like mesh networks where people can have like messaging that doesn't require like a centralized internet or whatever, but yeah, it's some freaky stuff. But
I was actually there, Daniel, in the Arab Spring, because that was the high point of this kind of idea of like networked new technologies creating. So 2011, I was in Tahrir Square in Egypt, then Bahrain, where the amazing kind of Pearl Roundabout. So I was there for this incredible euphoric. I was there when Mubarak resigned in Egypt, and it was like Egypt had just won the World Cup. Like the whole place just erupted, and that was largely fueled by social media. It was the high point of the hopes that was what these technologies would do. You had Wael Ghonim was the Egyptian Google executive who was kind of at the center of the protests there. And that was the sort of sense. And then there was a growing realization over the next few years of, oh no, these technologies can be weaponized as well. They can be used for good, but they can also be used for social control. So sort of a growing realization about that.
I think also for me, like, why didn't Ghonim then stay in Egypt and build sort of like a participatory democracy, social network infrastructure? Why didn't they then experiment with, because that's also where these tech companies are, still trapped in this like profit model. Whereas actually, that would have been the time to innovate with like, local. I mean, that's kind of the stuff I write about in How Soon Is Now. Is if we were to conceive of another model, it would be sort of like local participatory democracies, from like the very local to the bioregional to the planetary. With the nation states slowly becoming more like vestigial, the same way like aristocracies have since like the 17th or 18th century. But yeah, so it was like a huge opportunity lost. And another huge opportunity lost, I mean, where I disagree with Mearsheimer, because I feel that if NATO is essentially a defensive alliance, which it seems like it is, NATO actually exists because to stop Putin from doing exactly what Russia is now doing. So if Ukraine had been part of NATO, then we probably wouldn't be in this situation, if we'd done it at an earlier stage. But I mean, where I think, from my perspective, where the U.S. failed and the sort of the West failed was earlier on. Like if you read Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, she talks about how, as the USSR was breaking up, we had our, Chicago school economists of the Milton Friedman School went into Russia. They were like, okay, now you got to go into like turbocharged hypercapitalism. All of your enterprises are state-owned, so we smash them up, we sell them off to the highest bidder. That led to oligarchy, and it led to this kleptocratic system, and it led to Putinism. Whereas if we had a longer game plan, or a willingness to experiment, with other social systems, we'd be okay, like for a while, let's try like hybrid socialism, capitalism. Let's see what happens with these systems, if they can be beneficial. Because there were, benefits. Like if you talk to people who grew up in the Soviet countries, like there was a sense of commonality. There was a sense of, not such stratification between the wealthy and everybody else. There was a sense of like shared, collective interest. So yeah. We annihilated all of that stuff, and we said all you get now is free market capitalism, which is exactly what we did in the Arab Spring. So it's like, that's why we need like a new, social political ethos, a new idea for what we do with societies like post-catastrophe or post-rebellion. you know.
Yeah, you're right to point to, like, it was the 90s when we kind of imposed this very sort of naive free market capitalism. But you could argue the same thing happened in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So in a way, like, the problem of how you create the conditions for successful societies is a deeper one than that we haven't been able to figure out even to this day. Because what happened in Russia was, by imposing free market capitalism without functioning rule of law, without functioning press, without any of the civil society checks and balances that lead to functioning democracies in the West, all you did was created the conditions for oligarchy and takeover. And in the end, you had Putin, because he had the deepest, like the FSB or the KGB, because they had all the power before, they eventually just took over. And Putin is sort of the chief gangster recipient of that kind of very naive perspective that yeah, I completely agree. That's where we screwed Russia. But it's the same thing that then played out, particularly like Afghanistan is the most fascinating example, because we were there for 20 years and still managed to create almost no lasting institutions. Like, it's astonishing. Like, we have no idea how to do this.
But you can't impose those from above, right? They have to come from local culture. So you would have to, you know, have a much deeper sensitivity to local culture and you know, what types of, you know, positive new institutions can arise from what is already there, I think, you know.
But I imagine they were trying that in Afghanistan, and still that made no difference. Like, they were looking for people who wanted to kind of create girls' schools and all of the things that we thought were beneficial. But I think and I think they thought they'd created some kind of civil society, but they realized when the Taliban came back, it had no deep roots. Right. Because I think that's partly to do with the developmental map. If you look at like Wilbur's idea of developmental maps, they're trying to graft on a green or an orange system onto something that's probably deeply red and still very tribal. So maybe there are countries where that would work, and you can actually just support. Because for me, there's an obligation. If you look at somewhere like Russia, for me, there's an obligation of us morally supporting the protests in Russia, for example. Like, those people who are prepared to be arrested and jailed for opposing Putin. Like, for me, there's a strong moral obligation of supporting those people in whatever way that we can. That obviously Putin would then see as a kind of Western plot, or as a kind of Western imposition or interference in Russian internal affairs, which in some ways it is from his perspective. Like, there's no way of avoiding that. But at the same time, it feels to me to be a complete no-brainer that we should validate, support that kind of bravery among people trying to create a better society in Russia. But it's tricky.
What would that support look like, and what could we actually do for them? I mean, we had, and I've noticed that like apparently something like 1 million Ukrainians have been taken out of Ukraine and resettled in distant areas of Russia, and over 120,000 children apparently have been, you know, essentially kidnapped, and they're being, you know, given to Russian families to raise. I mean, you know, and that's actually, you know, among the many aspects of why this war is happening. One of them might actually be the sort of demographic crisis that Russia is facing. They have like an aging, you know, sad aging population. Nobody wants to reproduce anymore because it's so miserable there. So they're actually just going and like stealing like young people from another country to kind of keep their thing going. We don't seem to do, you know, we don't have any way to deal with that really. Like, what can we do? We're helpless, you know, at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the other things is this is an information war as much as it's anything else. And I wonder whether part of the kind of morale of the troops, that like everyone's been really clear, like the morale of the Russian troops has been terrible, might be because they're getting stuff on their smartphones, showing them like you can't really control the media as much as you need to. And so maybe some of that stuff is leaking through about what they're actually doing there. So I'm kind of reminded of things like even like Reuters or the British Council or any of these kind of outlets in places like Russia that are kind of bringing forth kind of Western values about kind of multiplicity of perspectives or a kind of functioning media independent from the government. Even those things are seen as kind of deliberate Western propaganda undermining Russian values by the Russian state. But those are the things that I think we have to I think we have to be much more confident in our values to some degree, while recognizing that a lot of the, structures.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big issue. We've totally lost confidence in our values, and for good reason. I mean, our values have not been well expressed, with things like the Iraq War and kind of yeah. I mean, it's a dicey situation.
Yes, but I would say, like, the flip side of that, I completely agree. Like, the Iraq War was worse than a crime. It was a blunder, and I think has polluted, has destroyed any.
I think crimes are still worse than blunders.
Yeah, well, that's a realist. That's a kind of famous realist quote. That the world will forgive crimes, but they will not forgive blunders.
Yeah.
That's sort of, it's a bit pokey. But like my perspective as well, that are you familiar with Paul Berman's work?
Yeah, sounds really familiar.
New York intellectual. He wrote Terror and Liberalism, and also Power and the Idealists, which is a story that I think needs to be better known, because he talks about how a lot of these kind of statesmen who came of age during the 1960s riots, like Bernard Kouchner and Joschka Fischer in Germany. Joschka Fischer was a Green politician who then became defense minister. And when he became defense minister, they found pictures of him kind of rioting in 1968. And there was a big scandal in Germany about, this kind of reprobate now is a politician. And Paul Berman tells the story of these kind of hugely anti-establishment types who had to then make peace with what it meant to actually have the responsibilities of power, and how he felt there was this sort of nascent sense of obligation and humanitarian intervention that was growing slowly through the 1990s, through Kosovo and through Yugoslavia, which originally was like, we're not going to get involved in that. And then there was sort of some sense of like obligation, and there were some humanitarian interventions, Sierra Leone in particular in 2001, and how this kind of nascent, I would say, positive development was then obliterated by Iraq, was taken advantage of by Bush and these sort of very cynical American, and Tony Blair for me is a kind of figure who was trying to hold it together, but in the end, I think made the deal with the devil of going with the Americans. And like, that is a really fascinating history, because I think after Iraq, the whole idea of anything like humanitarian intervention is toxic, and maybe needs to be toxic because you can't impose solutions from the outside. But I think that whole Iraq debate has completely toxified and destroyed, particularly on the left, any sense of being able to argue, because that whole Iraq thing is now framing our response to Syria. It's framing our response to many conflicts that have nothing to do with Iraq, and I think has been a kind of completely warping factor on the kind of landscape ever since, understandably. But I think seeing everything through the lens of Iraq is one of the central problems, even now, of the conversation around Ukraine, Russia, like only seeing like what the United States is up to, and seeing them as the prime actor and them being the main problem is deeply troubling.
I mean, another thing is, like, if you read Fiona Hill's book, I mean, it's clear that Putin is kind of brilliant. I mean, he did take a very rough hand of cards and built it up into a massive thing. I mean, he rebuilt the power of Russia to a great degree. And although now the Western media is saying that he's losing, and it's a disaster, and we're all coming together, it's not at all clear that he's even going to lose this at all. I mean, and because he's been studying the West for decades, and he saw what he notices, like and I think you mentioned this earlier, autocratic regimes, like, as long as he's in power, it's very simple. He just says, we do this and we do that. With us, like, if somebody else gets elected, if Trump gets elected in 2024, all of our initiative to try to like help Ukraine, could just collapse, or we could have, I mean, the right wing is a catastrophe in the U.S. And so he may not be thinking that it's going as badly as we think it is for him. Even with the soldiers getting chewed up and the military, because he's just going to build. I mean, he has oil, he has resources, he has metal. He can just keep building stuff and like throwing it into the mix until he grinds us down. So that's another thing. We don't even know which perspective is accurate at this point. I mean, hopefully, here, I mean, it's like tragic because like I think I've hated the U.S. military budget and our, but suddenly I'm reading about 155 howitzers with 152 howitzers, and I'm really hoping ours are like, significantly better than the old Soviet 152 ones or whatever. But we have been putting 800 billion a year, into the military budget. Hopefully we have, some useful stuff.
So you're a kind of late blooming hawk.
I'm not a hawk at all. I mean, I'm a pacifist, but I mean, that's the thing is it's like we're looking at this pile-on of catastrophe on top of catastrophe. I mean, how can we possibly, I mean, the climate movement is growing. There's been more, expressions of, for climate justice or reparations, whatever, in the US, the UK, 1,000 climate scientists around the world, but, just got arrested or whatever, protested. But, we can't do anything as long as Russia is this fully regressive thing. I mean, the oil and the coal is going to keep flowing. I mean, China is still building probably coal plants, as far as I know. I mean, so it's all interlinked in some way, right? Like, how do we make any real progress until somehow this changes, if it can change,
Yeah, this is another topic we could jump off on. But the one thing I will say, my framing with the climate conversation has always been this intense focus on the West has always seemed quite naive, given China is creating a new coal-fired power station every week. Like, the geopolitics of it, I think, is very difficult to see how, because they're also not responsive to public opinion. Like, the problem, like, it doesn't matter how many pretty pictures of Greta Thunberg or kind of lambasting kind of the Western leaders we have, actually they are in many ways more responsive and more amenable to public opinion, and whereas China and Russia just aren't. And I don't see how you get any collective action without them being involved. And it's kind of naive. Like, in a way, like, I understand people who are saying, well, go on, Greta, why don't you go to Beijing and just see what response you get there? Like, that I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess the argument until recently has been that our legacy use of CO2 is still, gigantic, proportionally compared to these other countries, which have just gotten into the game more recently. And, there's also the, the reality that China, I think, is, has already created more renewable energy, by far, and has that potential. I mean, what I argued in, How Soon Is Now, trying to figure out a solution kind of model, if the West, because in a way, like, China has taken a lot of, Western capitalism and kind of, instituted it in their own form. If we were to develop a new sort of, eco-anarchist, local model that, was better for people, maybe that would become something that other cultures in the world would start to imitate, and for me, then that comes back to, consciousness, monistic idealism, psychedelic experience, like, maybe there's a whole different line of flight towards like a local utopian model that isn't so dependent on, all this energy output and industrial use.
We've got plenty more topics that we haven't even touched yet, Daniel, but I think this is a good place to close this one. So thank you. Yeah, thank you. As I said, it's overdue. I've really enjoyed this conversation and look forward to more in the future.
Me too, buddy. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching all the way to the end. So we release videos on YouTube around once a week, and you can also find all these interviews and conversations on the Rebel Wisdom podcast feed. And we're also doing deep dive written newsletters on Substack. Check out the link in the show notes and please sign up there, and you'll get everything sent direct to your inbox, including special previews, extra content for subscribers, and also you can join the conversation that we're hosting on Substack. We've also recently launched a big project called the Sense Making Companion. It's split into 3 parts with videos, workbooks, and much more, and it's completely free. Again, check out the link in the show notes and hope to see you soon.